In this session, we talk about making sense of a qualitative study. These are just the very first steps in looking through an empirical study, in this case, a qualitative study. Previously, we had talked about how to look at different aspects of an empirical article, and we had said that we do want to identify the research purpose, relationships, and so on. So let's open an empirical article and look into the different elements of a qualitative research study. The example that we are using today is from the Leadership Journal, and it is Encouraging Servant Leadership, a qualitative study of how a cause-related sporting event inspires participants to serve. So let's come down. As with any academic article, we do want to look into the abstract first to give us an idea of the study that was conducted. Here you can see that a longitudinal qualitative case study was conducted. Let's break that apart. Firstly, it is a qualitative study. Secondly, it says that it is a case study. A case study is when a particular setting is used as a focal point to examine a phenomenon that you are interested in studying. So in this case, the phenomenon is to explore if a cause-related sporting event could inspire participants to serve others, and that particular phenomenon is looked through a particular case. In this example, we want to understand what is the case that was studied. So as we look into the article, we will try to identify the case. You also see that this is a longitudinal study. What is a longitudinal study? A longitudinal study is when data is collected from the same participants, the same data sources, at different points in time, over time, to see how something changed. That is a longitudinal study. Very often you see a survey being administered at a particular point of time, or interviews being conducted to examine the topic of study. But when they are conducted only once, it's called a cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study is a study of the phenomenon at that cross-section of time. So in this case, this is slightly different because it looks like data was collected at different points in time to see if the cause-related sporting event inspired participants to serve others. Okay. Let's go down. And as we discussed earlier, every academic article starts with an introduction of the constructs that are being studied and the contexts within which they are being studied. We do want to be always looking out for the purpose of the study as articulated by the authors. A good research study always has a clear articulation of the purpose. Here, they say the purpose of the study was to investigate the encouragement of servant leadership in participants of a cause-related sporting event and to determine how the event facilitated this. A purpose has to be clearly stated, and as you look at the article, you want to see whether that purpose was met. The research questions typically should follow the research purpose. In the example of the quantitative study that we explored, the hypotheses followed the research purpose. In a qualitative study, you never have a hypothesis. Hypothesis only is appropriate when you are testing the hypothesis, and that is always in a quantitative study. In a qualitative study, you will always have the research questions that support the research purpose. In this case, do the transplant games encourage the practice of servant leadership and help inspire participants to serve others? Right? And then, how do the transplant games inspire them to achieve this? I'm guessing that the transplant games is the case, is the context within which they are conducting the study. So you can look at the paper in more detail to understand those details. As we come down this paper, we also see that the theoretical framework has been described clearly. For example, the servant leadership theory has been explained using Greenleaf's theory. Greenleaf 1970 has written about servant leadership in an organizational context, and so they describe the theoretical underpinnings of the study and refer to literature reviews that have been conducted and application of the theory in sports settings. They go in this table. This is interesting because they are identifying the characteristics of a servant leader: listening, empathy, healing, awareness, and so on. And anytime these theories come up and you're using a theory for a qualitative study, it is important to note that these characteristics in this case would then be important in the data analysis and coding of the qualitative data. So I want you to pay attention to how these theories and concepts are being used. I was trying to highlight just the left column. I'm not able to do that, but you get the idea. So this paper continues to talk about other theories that are relevant to this topic, this paper. This is what I would like to highlight. This section here, NKFUS Transplant Games, they have a whole section for this because this is the setting for the research. Remember, we said it is a case study. They are looking at the 2010 NKFUS Transplant Games as the case within which to explore their research. Okay, so in a case study, you always have a good description of the context, the setting, the case. And here they have gone on to not only discuss what the NKF games are, but they go on to talk about the objectives and so on. So readers have a good understanding of why this case is appropriate. Every empirical study has a method section. Some call it methods, some call it methodology. So depending on the article, look for that section. They describe this as an exploratory qualitative case study methodology. So we discussed that previously. We also see that that a longitudinal approach was adopted. Now, how do you pick a case? What is the context that you're picking? In a case study, it is important to discuss why that case was suitable. In this case, they say that this context was chosen because it is an extreme case. An extreme case is when it is possible to explore that phenomenon in a highlighted fashion. So in this case, did servant leadership occur because of this type of a sporting event? So it's an extreme case that was highlighted. You will learn more about case studies in later courses, but this is good to read as we go through this article. Okay. Just as we did in the quantitative study, in a qualitative study too, the sample that was studied is important to understand. Here, within the case, which is Team Florida, they looked at 124 members, 54 transplant recipients, and 4 living donors, donor families, supporters, and caregivers. As you go on, you see that several data gathering techniques were utilized. In a case study, you can use any type of data that will help examine the phenomenon that you are studying. You can use qualitative data, you can use quantitative data, you can do interviews, you can do focus groups, all of that. In this particular study, they had 3 focus groups consisting of 2 pre-event and 1 post-event. So remember, we said it's a longitudinal study. They did the focus group 2 times, one before the event and one after the event. And that means that data was collected at different points in time. In addition to the focus groups, they also had open-ended qualitative questionnaires. That is another data collection method that was used. Third, there was observation, direct observation during events 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., right? And then there was a document analysis. So do you see how different data collection methods, and finally semi-structured personal interviews, all of these were different data collection methods that were included because it's a case study. In a case study, you can use any type of data collection method to help understand the question under exploration. You can also see here, data analysis was conducted using Strauss and Corbin's open axial and selective coding. They talked about using recommendations from Miles and Huberman for a priori coding, and so on. Okay, so for the moment, that is the extent to which we want to go into the details. Later, you will learn about trustworthiness in qualitative studies, which runs parallel to construct validity and other types of validity that you ensure for a quantitative study. Always pay attention to the findings and the discussion, because this section really summarizes for us how the research study addressed the research questions. So in a qualitative study, you see a table which has qualitative data, unlike statistical results, which you see in inferential statistics. Here, the questions under examination are highlighted using quotations from your participants. So having a good table which highlights different aspects provides a good summary of the data. All right, so this is an example of a qualitative case study. One last thing I want to share is about the proposed conceptual framework that these authors present on page 502. Now, I'm squinting a bit. I'm tilting my head to read this. I'm sure there is a way to tilt it, but for now, we can just see how organizational goals are impacting structural mechanisms, and through social processes, it is impacting individual impact, and that is leading to the practice of servanthood. And then the outcome is a sustainable community of servant leaders. So how they proposed this was after they looked at the data, and based on the data, the links between event-related social events, building a community, developing broader identities, and participants practicing servant leader attributes are presented in figure 1. So in other words, they were able to visually present the relationships that they saw in their data with this figure here. And I want you to see how this is different from a quantitative study. So to wrap up, in this qualitative research study, we looked at the research purpose. We looked at what is the phenomenon being explored. We looked at the context of the study, the sample for the study. We looked at the section where we can read more details about the findings. And in this paper, there was also a visual representation of the phenomenon that was presented after data analysis. Just a thought to keep in mind as you continue looking at quantitative and qualitative research is a reminder that quantitative research is deductive, meaning you start with theory, you look at the literature, and based on theory and the literature, you present a hypothesis and test the theory, right? You're just seeing whether data supports the theory or not. So you start with theory. In qualitative research, it is inductive, meaning you start with the data. What are people telling you? What are you observing? That data leads us to the relationships and a theoretical or conceptual contribution of the phenomenon. Yes, you use theories, you use theoretical concepts to ground your study, but really you are basing your knowledge on data. It is what your participants are telling you, it is what you are seeing. Whatever data that you are seeing has more primacy in qualitative studies than in quantitative studies. Qualitative studies are conducted inductively. This is inductive research versus deductive research for quantitative studies. We will talk more about these different ways of conducting research in future sessions.